Please welcome our next speaker, Marie Rogers, a senior implementation consultant. Today, she will be presenting on GP workflow, a few things to know before you start. Please stick around after Marie's session for a live Q&A.
Hi, welcome to DynamicsCon. My name is Marie Rogers. I am a GP consultant with Columbus Global. I've been working with Great Plains for over 20 years. And today we're going to talk about workflow, a few things to know before you get started. The topics for today are starting your workflow, tips to set up GP workflow, system setup overview, like approvals, email actions, document attach, company workflow administration, calendar setup, and at the end we'll have a live Q&A. So let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, starting your workflow. Is your organization using GP 2013 R2 or higher? If it's not, workflow is not available in the earlier versions, but most likely you are on something higher than GP 2013 R2. If you're not, of course, you can talk to your partner about upgrading to a later version. Microsoft has continued to add functionality with each version from GP 2013 R2. That's where it began and has added more functionality as the years progressed and the different versions have been released. I'll be showing you the features that are available in GP 2018.2. The other question that you need to ask is, are all of your users in the same domain in Active Directory? So if they are not in the same domain, that may be something that needs to be discussed within your infrastructure and possibly join the domains. The other thing is, are you using Office 365 or Microsoft Exchange for your email delivery system? You would need to be using a Microsoft email delivery system in order for workflow to work for you properly. So if you answered all these questions yes, then you would be able to successfully implement GP workflow. Tips to set up GP workflow. There are two ways to set up GP workflow in your organization. The top half of this window indicates enabling the workflow action, which is the basic workflow action. This will enable workflows to be submitted. It will send an email to the approver, and the approver will log into Great Plains and approve the transaction within Great Plains. The second option, which is the bottom half of the screen, when this is enabled, the emails can be done outside of Great Plains via email. So if you're using Office 365 or Exchange, the user can simply open up their email. They'll have options to approve from there. You can access this window by going to Administration, Setup, System Workflow. This is where I would suggest you set up an email address that is specifically for the GP workflow. You can define the email address in Active Directory and then assign that to this option here where it has email address. The display name would be, of course, like a GP workflow or something that would indicate to the approver when they receive the email that the email is from the workflow. You would put in your either Exchange server or Office 365 address. And then on the bottom half, that's where you would need to configure the ability to send emails or actually receive a response from the email back into Great Plains. This is going to require GP web services to be installed and configured on the SQL Server where your GP database resides. Now that this is set up. When you enter a transaction and you submit a transaction for workflow, it doesn't matter who you're logged into Great Plains as. It only matters what Active Directory you're logged into the computer as, because the workflow uses Active Directory and relies heavily on it. A way to enhance your workflow is to use the document attachments. This window can be found under Administration Company Document Attachment Setup. This is where you can allow transactions to flow through Dynamics. You can attach them documents to transactions. You can attach documents to vendor cards, customer cards, inventory items, such transactions such as general ledger, AP invoice transactions, purchase orders. So whenever you're in a window in GP and you're in a transaction window or you're in a master record, you can see this attachment icon up at the top on the toolbar. That'll indicate that it's available for you to attach a document. This enhances your workflow capability because once you submit a workflow, you can also have the attachment be attached to the approval transaction in your email. So when the approver receives an email, they'll also receive an attachment that helps explain that particular document. To set up the workflow steps, you can go to GP Workflow Company Setup, which is on the administration page, Setup Company, Workflow, Workflow Maintenance. This is where you would set up the steps for each type of workflow. The different types of workflow that are available is by module. In the financial series, the general ledger account setup, the general ledger batch. On the sales side, receivables batches and sales transactions. On the purchasing side, payables batches, payables transactions, purchase orders, purchase requisitions, purchasing invoices, and receiving transactions, as well as vendor approval. Workflows available on payroll, employee profiles, employee skills, payroll direct deposits, payroll time cards, payroll W-4. In project, expense reports, timesheets. And on the administration side, you can use the workflow for security roles, security tasks, smart list designer views, user approval, and user security. To set up a workflow calendar, it's important in the workflow so that the workflow that you submit doesn't expire by the time someone has an opportunity to approve their assigned transaction or card. Under Administration Setup Company Workflow Calendar, you can set up a calendar that is based on your standard work week, as well as any holidays that your organization observes, so that when, like I said, if you submit a workflow and the approval time limit is maybe 2 days, if you submit it on a Friday afternoon, it might be expired by the time someone would come in on Monday morning. So it's important to set up your workflow calendar. You can also customize your emails. So when we were talking about the emails that would be sent to an approver, these are the different types of emails that you can set up. So on the left side is a sample of an email message setup in the system. And then on the right side is what the email looks like when you receive it as an approver. So it will tell you that the task has been assigned, and then it'll give you a deadline based on your calendar. You'll have approve, reject, and delegate when you have the workflow set up to approve via email. It'll have information about your transaction and it'll show details about your transaction in this little table at the bottom. Now you can notice on the left there's little hooks in here that pull in the data. So when you configure your email messages, you're configuring it with these hooks to pull the data and present it in this format that you see on the right. So when you're setting up a new workflow, you would go through and determine the type of workflow. And in this example, we have vendors where we're setting up a workflow for vendor approval. This is where you would set up the options to send notifications. So you can send email notifications to the originator for all of the actions that take place with the workflow. You can also set some options for escalating your workflow if it has expired. Where does it go when the task is overdue? Do you escalate it to another approver, or do you take no action or escalate it to a specific person? So this is where you define that kind of setup for that workflow. This is also where you would activate the workflow. In order for it to be used, you'd have to activate it. So that's a common thing, that once you go through all the options of setting everything up, you forget to click the activate button. So that's where you would look to do that. When you create a step for the workflow, this is where you define things like, is there going to be any particular condition? So if the first step goes to a person, there may not be any condition at all. It always goes to this person. So the action is always required for this step is the condition that really doesn't require any criteria, or there is no condition. So it's always going to go to that first approver. Now you can add a second step too and have a condition involved. It can be a lot of different things. It can be based on a vendor, like in this particular case, on a vendor approval, it's pretty straightforward. So it'll most likely be just, one or two people. But in this example, there's a workflow condition for a purchase order. And in this example, we have Sue submitting a purchase order. And if you look at the top, the first step, Frank, he must approve if the vendor is Northwind Traders. So there is a condition there, and that condition is that Frank has to approve anything for Northwind Traders. The second step here is an option that has no condition, which Andreas has to approve always. Same thing with Anne. So you can mix up the options with conditions and no conditions. In the bottom here is an example of, say, Sue submits a purchase order, but Jill must approve if it's greater than $10,000. And then, of course, there's a next step too, and you can use it based on dollar amount and have different steps, approvers go through the step of approving it when it's a high dollar amount. So Sue's up to 20,000, John is up to 30,000. Also, in the bottom section of the workflow step is where you actually assign the approver. So you're going to be basically using Active Directory to assign your users and groups. So when you click on the magnifying glass next to the Assign To, you're going to see the Active Directory option. So you can start typing someone's name and look through Active Directory to find a particular user. You can also use groups, and you can also use Active Directory hierarchy within the GP workflow, but usually you'll need to work with your IT team to see if they have the hierarchy set up. Hierarchy means that within Active Directory, you can assign who reports to who, and the the organization structure within the IT within the Active Directory so that you can determine where a step would go next. This is also where you assign the time limit. We talked about the workflow calendar as well, and the time limit would be assigned here. It can be 8 hours, it can be multiple days, it can be even a week or two, as long as you want to give them to approve this item. You can set it up to have that time limit. There's also reminders. Apply a workflow calendar is the box that you can have it use the calendar, and then reminders will give them reminders within a different time frame. So you may set it up for a time limit of a week, but then in 4 days you may want to have them be reminded that they have something out there to approve. It'll send the same email message. And at the bottom where you mark the send email message, this is where you assign what email message you're going to use in this particular workflow. So in this case, we're using the assign vendor approval workflow email message. You can also include the document attached documents, the ones that we talked about earlier. These will be included in the workflow. Also, the completion policy. If you need more than one person to approve this, and say you've assigned it to more than one person or a group, you can set the completion policy on the right to have only one must approve, or the majority must approve, or all must approve. So once the workflow, in this case our vendor workflow, has been activated, this is what the screen would look like from the GP side of it. So you would enter a vendor, and you can see across the toolbar you have an attach button. You can click your attach button and attach your document. And then when you're ready to submit your vendor card, you'd click the submit button. Once it's been submitted, it will send an email to the approver, and then they can approve it. If for some reason something changes, so say for instance you needed to recall this, you could pull that particular vendor back up, and you could see an option. You'll see an option for recall. So say you needed to make a change. The system doesn't let you make a change once it's already been submitted unless you recall it. So that's the let's see what it looks like from the GP side when you set up a workflow approval for a new vendor. You'll see the screen print I have here on the right shows the attach button and the submit button. So if you've entered a new vendor, you can click the attach button and attach a document to that vendor, and then you'll see there's a submit button once the workflow is activated. You'll click the submit button, and the approval request will be sent to via email to the approver. If you need to basically see where it is in the process, you can pull up that vendor again. For instance, you'll see down in the bottom section of this screen print, it says vendor approval pending GP admin. So it'll give you the date and the time and who the approver is, so you'll know where it is in the status. You can also, if you make a change to this, say you put in the wrong address or something, you can go back and make the change to it, but it'll require that you recall the vendor approval, and then you'll have to resubmit it. So that's the control there. You can't make changes to something that you've already submitted. You can also view the workflow history. So if you, let me jump back to this last slide here. You'll notice I didn't circle it, but right next to recall is a view history. So say, for instance, you wanted to see the history related to this particular workflow. You can pull up that transaction and click the view history. And what you'll see here are the different steps that walk you through what happened with this workflow. So here's the workflow, basically tree over on the left. And then this is every type of action that takes place for this particular workflow. You can also check your status by looking at the navigation lists. So say, for instance, you wanted to see where the status of these vendors that you set up, where the approval is in the process. You can use your navigation lists on the left-hand side to pull up either vendors not submitted, vendors pending approval, or I set up one that was another option, say maybe final approved, that type of thing. You can set up other options. So this will tell you where you are in the approval process. And if you are an approver, you can also use these navigation lists. And when you pull up a navigation list and you're the approver, you can mark the box next to it, and you can barely see it up at the top, but there's a check mark where you can approve and complete it from here. Also, you can delegate. Say, for instance, you plan to be out of the office on vacation and you want to delegate your approval tasks to someone else. So you can use this. It's under the Microsoft Dynamics GP user preferences and then workflow delegation. You can assign all of your workflow tasks to one person, or you can specifically, by workflow task, assign which person is going to be the approver for those in your absence. You can also, say for instance, an approver is out of the office unexpectedly. Maybe they're sick or had an emergency situation where they were going to be out for a couple of days and needed someone to delegate their tasks. The administrator can go in under the Setup Company workflow and edit the workflow approver for those tasks. So say, for instance, you do have an accident or something and you're out of the office. The administrator can go in here and choose how they want to look up the particular options and how they want to set them, and pull up the assignment and then delegate that assignment to someone else. Thank you, everybody, for joining my session today. Thank you, DynamicsCon, for your support. And let's go to the live Q&A. Hi, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
It looks like we have a couple questions coming in, Marie. First off, we have a question from Gary. What is needed in the SMPT authentication window?
Good question, Gary. That may be a little bit more technical for me as an application consultant. So let's write that down and we can get back to you on that one. It's a little bit more technical than what I can handle.
All right, thanks, Marie. I see another question here. Is it possible to set up workflow on hosted cloud servers? The domain use to log in GP server is different from the domain which users use for their email in Windows.
We have had situations like that before where we have had to create, we have to basically have the user log in when they're approving the workflow as a different user. So we have had that situation come up. So it's doable. It's just a little bit more configuration on the hosted environment to create the user, set up their email address. They may have a different password for that login when they go to the approval. So it's possible. It's just a little bit more setup.
Thanks. And a question here, a follow-up. Even though there are emails involved in this process, everyone in the approval process would need GP access. Is that correct?
Only if you're using the basic workflow. If you're using the workflow with email actions, only the users, if you're doing that, whoever the approver is does not have to be a GP user. They just have to be a domain user. I hope that answers your question.
Great. And that's similar. We have another question here. Can you set up workflow approval based on domain groups? I see how to do it by user, but not groups.
You can do it by groups. You can choose a group if it's available in your Active Directory, if you have the group set up. You can also use the hierarchy within Active Directory. So if that's set up in Active Directory, you can use the hierarchy there to drive the workflow.
Great. All right. We'll give a few minutes here just in case there's additional questions. Please enter them into the chat. Marie, is there a contact email that you could give just in case?
My contact email is marr@columbusglobal.com. No other questions?
Right. We do have one just popped in here.
Okay.
Another follow-up. It could be me, but I have multiple layers for approval. The audit will show each step as not needed for approval. So I have 20 levels and only one is valid. I still see the other 19 levels.
That is true.
Unique? Okay.
Yes, that is true. The steps, it'll go through each one of the steps and determine, is this something that I need to use, and it'll ignore it. And if you're looking at the workflow history, which it kind of sounds like you are, it will show all of the steps, and only the ones that it actually followed down that path will, show any kind of action. The tables actually keep every type of action that takes place. So anytime anything happens with that workflow, even like say for a vendor card, it'll go back and also keep a record if there was a change.
And another question from Gary here. On a follow-up to the domain group question, so instead of selecting a user, I select group. Is that correct?
Yes. Everybody in the group should receive an email, and then that would be where you might want to use your, the option to everybody must approve, or the majority must approve, or at least one must approve.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Marie.
Thank you.
If there's no more questions, I guess we can wrap it up here. Anything you want to share to the group, Marie, before we sign off?
No, thank you so much for joining my session, and thank you for all the sponsors and the whole DynamicsCon group. They've been really great to work with. So thank you all, and have a great day. Bye-bye.